Slowly people joining in. I should have brought a party trigger too, or maybe some background music to keep all of you entertained while we're kicking off or while we're waiting to kick off this webinar today. So let us just slowly begin with a small introduction to myself and Wilko. I am the Chief Strategy Officer here at Vaimo. I work with clients and I also work as a senior capacity, especially in the field of technology and commerce, to help them to figure out whether they should actually look into composable commerce or not. And joining me today is Wilko.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Wilko. I am the Chief Technology Officer for Vaimo. I am based in Tallinn in Estonia, and I focus in general on our technical direction as the organization, but more specifically these days, I actually spend a lot of time on the technology side of this composable commerce topic. Yeah, that's me.
So between the two of us, we'll be able to both cover commercial side, but also technical side. And we hope by the end of the webinar today that you'll have a bit more understanding of what it is, whether it'll be a good fit for you. We also come with practical examples on how you can onboard yourself into this and also into evaluating whether this is a good fit for you or not. Feel free during the webinar to ask any questions in the chat, and we will just pick it up in the end. But yeah, welcome. So before we kind of move into the details and all the technical details around composable commerce and around headless, which is a very technical topic, I just want to take a step back and just share a little bit on, the evolution that we've seen around customer experience over time. So if we go back to the mid 2000s, companies offered a very single channel experience. The digital experience was picking up, but it was very isolated. So I can just give a very practical example, like e-banking, for example. The banks was actually one of the innovators and one of the trailblazers, but still back then, there were some things that you could do online, but there was also other things that really required for you to go down into the bank counter, meet a physical person to sign some papers. And also just within e-commerce, it was very isolated. It was not usually connected to the main business model and was only part of the catalog that you'll be able to find online. And we also just have to remember, like back then, that was actually around the time that the first iPhone was launched as well. So it's quite a lot of years ago. After that, we moved into more the era of omnichannel, and that happened around 2012, 13. And this was very much pushed by the growth of consumer e-com, and also us, like just as consumers adopting smartphones and so on. And I remember back then, like the omnichannel topic really started to pick up. Retailers was looking into launching big programs on being able just to offer an omnichannel experience. Some of these things that we today just think was very simple, was very complicated back then. Just having price parity online and in store could be very difficult, since all stores was just used to run very independently. And that also go from assortment. So just being able to show stock online and being able then to say that you want to buy that stock and pick that up in the store was a big challenge. But all that seems to be like a long time ago. And if we're then looking into this decade, like digital customer experience really have evolved, and of course, due to many companies investing into it, but also us as consumers and users setting higher expectations. So today is not just a matter of just offering products in multiple channels. It's about this really deep customer understanding, and also being able to orchestrate like the right experience at the right time, regardless of the channel that they're using, regardless of they're sitting on your Facebook marketplace, or sitting on your e-com store or inside your physical store. And what we clearly see, and what all the numbers also show, is that consumers and users now have more touch points than ever in their journey. So really for companies to become like the champions and the industry leaders of tomorrow, they need to have the agility in the business to be able to optimize their core business model, or just transform into the opportunities as they appear. And this is of course driven also by increased market or increased change in the market. The market is more global. The buying behavior is changing as well. So companies just need to adapt to this constant change. And secondly, they also need to be able to create and deliver value-creating customer experiences. So not just focusing on selling a product, and being able to embed themselves into the full customer journey. Again, just moving out from just selling the product, but also understanding when can I be relevant whenever consumers or customers are starting to look for the products that I'm selling. And of course, this needs to be backed up by having control of your data and also being able to apply some intelligence on top of that data. So this constant change and evolution puts a lot of requirements towards your tech stack. And, and the tech stack needs to be able to help you to onboard into new channels or just to recalibrate at a very, very high pace.
Okay, so as Henrik already said, the IT side needs to support these business needs. So the architecture also needs to adapt, and our systems really need to be designed specifically to support this business agility. It's not really an afterthought anymore. And you no longer want to rely on a single platform that attempts to do everything really, really, really well, but you instead would like to be able to pick these so-called best-of-breed systems for different types of needs. Security is also very, very critical these days, and you really want to safeguard some of your systems, the systems of record, your master data, and so on. You want to safeguard them away from the customer touch points. And at the same time, these type of systems tend to also be quite core to your business, and you want relatively little disruption there because it impacts your entire organization. And ultimately, you would like to have much more scale today, at the same time being able to keep your costs under control. So to unify all these demands into sort of architectural design, we take inspiration from a model that Gartner described and called the pace-layered architecture. So the idea here is that you would categorize the different IT systems in your organization, or sometimes you would even split IT systems so that you can categorize parts of them separately, and you categorize them based on their pace of change. And roughly speaking, or the layers defined are three, where at the top you have your systems of innovation. They change the fastest. They are the user-facing ones. There you want to follow the user trends. You want to potentially even experiment with ideas that you potentially even throw away when they don't work, but you need to see what works and follow the customer. And in this area, you will find the so-called headless front ends, web apps, mobile apps, your Facebook marketplace, as Henrik mentioned, might fit in here. In the middle of the diagram, you have your so-called systems of differentiation. This is where your main processes and capabilities lie. And this is where you really want those so-called best-of-breed technologies. You want the best commerce engine, you want the best content management system, and they fit into this layer. And lastly, at the bottom are those so-called systems of record, which are your core systems. They usually change quite infrequently. In fact, you might not want them to change very quickly because it has ripple effects in your organization. Your organization needs to adapt to those. And those are much more entrenched in your business. You can think of your ERP. This is a very mature technology today. It is relatively standardized in different companies, and you wouldn't change that a lot every time your customers expect something new from you. So using this model, we acknowledge that there are different needs for speed and control for different types of IT systems and IT processes. And when we categorize them into these different layers and acknowledge that we don't need the same processes and the same approach for all of these systems, then we can adjust our process and design them specifically for the pace of change in each of these layers. So a good example of this is what we've seen over the last few years is this idea of headless, where the commerce engine no longer takes care of the presentation layer, and instead there's a separate front end that is the customer touch point. So this would be your system of innovation in this model. And Henrik already changed slide for me. So Traditionally, what you would see is on the left-hand side is you would see that the commerce engine includes the presentation layer or the user interface. And in fact, many commerce platforms cover many areas that are not actually directly related to commerce. And some of the older commerce systems even combine everything from ERP to stock management to warehouse management, content management, everything into one single system. And if we look instead at the headless technologies that have appeared over the last few years, the front-end layer is then decoupled from the commerce engine. It's actually a separate system. And it talks to the commerce engine simply via APIs. And APIs are really interfaces or interface specifications, or potentially you can call them contracts of how two IT systems can communicate with one another. And usually also because these interfaces describe what one system can expect from one another, these are also relatively slow-moving things, whereas the actual behavior or functionality that each system implements can iterate much faster. So when the commerce engine is headless, in fact, you're not even limited to a single front-end layer anymore. So the same infrastructure that you have in place could be used for other front ends too, such as I mentioned, the mobile apps, the social channels. Maybe you have in-store displays that you would like to have information on. And some of that information no longer needs to come from the commerce engine. Okay, so you have a lot more flexibility in this model. So let's start looking at this platform-based architecture. So this is where on the left-hand side, we select a platform that is built on a concept with a large set of well-proven sort of out-of-the-box features. And from there on, you move to customize each of these features to meet your business needs. And compared to a platform-based architecture, the composable architecture is generally speaking based on microservices. Some of them might evolve to be larger services than micro, but we'll stick with that for now. And where each of these different services are isolated from the other ones, and they are agnostic building blocks that can operate independently, but of course also communicate with one another. And maybe to put this into an analogy, we could possibly take the example of an iMac and compare it to a custom-built PC. So in the platform-based approach, the architecture follows a set of principles and guidelines that are defined by the manufacturer. Usually this is part of a larger ecosystem, so it comes with a lot of benefits. There's ease of integration to other technologies, shared data models, ready-made functionalities. And just like in the Apple ecosystem, you know that it basically, if you buy some additional piece of extension, it just works. And in this iMac model, Apple essentially defines the reference for everything in that ecosystem. And it has a lot of benefits and a lot of value for money if the needs fit with the functionality of that specific system. Usually these systems can be customized, but just like the Mac, you will ultimately reach a point where you need to upgrade the entire system to a new version. Usually we start seeing this kind of platform life cycle in the range of 5 to 8 years. If we now look at the composable architecture on the right-hand side, this is more, we should think of this more as a set of building blocks, where you're able to add and replace and enhance parts of the system as you go. And this gives you, of course, endless flexibility and makes it possible for you really to optimize every little detail of your system. And you work on a much lower level or granular level of your architecture. And because you can change pieces along the way and improve and upgrade parts of it, this idea of a big re-platform usually doesn't really happen anymore. But of course, as with a custom PC, this requires higher level of technical experience and architecting. So you make sure that the right pieces are put together, that a change of one component actually results in an improvement. to your overall solution. Okay, but let's have a look at what this looks like with one of our clients, where we've been a little bit through the journey from the one to the other. So we have one of our clients. They are using the Adobe Commerce platform, which is traditionally speaking a platform-based solution. And we were using it originally with its default front end, which is integrated into the Commerce platform. But then we used a separate content management system to handle all the content. That was way back in the days. It actually came from WordPress, but these days we're using Adobe's AEM solution. So the commerce part comes from Adobe Commerce, and the content comes from AEM. But they are still, in the original model, two separate applications, each with their own front end. But we wanted to present this all on the same page to the user. So we ended up having a fairly clever technical solution to seamlessly stitch together the outputs of these two different front ends together. So the header of the page comes from the commerce system, and the body really comes from the CMS system. And it's connected in such a way that the user doesn't really understand or know that this comes from two different systems. It just quite seamlessly gets stitched together. However, of course, if I say clever technical solution, that can also actually mean things that clever can mean complicated. Clever can mean it requires special knowledge. It's custom. It's not normal in this environment. It needs to be maintained. It needs to be supported. So in fact, we do put some effort into maintaining this part, this little clever hack. So what we've now done with this client, this is of course all part of a intended journey, is that we have already moved them to a headless front end. So there we are using Adobe's PWA Studio. And now this front end more properly consumes the content and the commerce parts, amongst, of course, other things, in a headless way. So this single front end is now no longer stitching together of multiple technologies, but it's one technology that fully owns the entire experience towards the user. So instead of, and the client now is together with us, that we're migrating this store by store. So we're doing an incremental rollout rather than replace everything in one go. And there are still a few stores left. But maybe this is a bit technical, but there's also another area that is not directly technical or related to the maintenance of the solution. And that is, in this project, it now allows our teams, multiple teams, in fact, to work independently from each other. Our client now has 3 teams from us working on different aspects of that solution, and they can work fairly parallel with fairly low overhead in communication between them. And in top of those 3 teams, there's an external agency also working on a loyalty app for that same client. All of that happens concurrently. And in fact, the technologies involved are now really require different technical competence. So Adobe Commerce is PHP, the AEM content management system is based on Java. So that already allows us now to specialize our teams more rather than having completely generalized teams that try to be able to be good at everything. We also see some side effects that some of the front-end developers that are now working in this headless front-end don't need to know they don't really need to know Adobe Commerce as a product that much anymore, because now the front-end isn't technically part of Adobe Commerce anymore. So this gives additional flexibility in how our teams work with this. Okay, but originally, as I said, this was a single platform solution, and now it is becoming, slowly, we're transforming this more into a composed solution. But I want to show you quickly also the architecture of this transformation, or at least what we started from and sort of the generalized view of where we want to go to. So this is an architecture diagram showing 2 different architectures. And I put this here for visual comparison. So don't look at all the individual components and the lines and the blocks and the text. Instead, maybe just pay attention to the red block in each of the diagrams. So on the diagram on the left, which is really the original starting point, This is the pure platform approach. Everything really goes through this commerce engine or commerce platform in this regard. And the commerce platform is the heart of everything. It's the be all and end all. All lines essentially somehow get routed through this platform. Often this is for the simple reason that this platform is what provides the user interface. So it needs to have access to the information. If you now look at the diagram on the right and you look at where's the red block there, you will see that it is maybe accidentally, but on the side. But if you look at the number of lines that go towards or from that block, it's much, much fewer. At the same time, also other components, some of those other components don't even have a connection to the commerce engine because they really provide a service that is not directly dependent on the commerce engine. It's then the front end really that is able to consume the information and the services from those across those services and provide the right customer experience. So small caveat, maybe the complexity on the right is not necessarily less. There are, generally speaking, more moving parts, but each component is so much less tied to the rest of the architecture, which allows much more flexibility around that component. In fact, in software development, we often think about how flexible something is in terms of how easy is it to remove it. And that's usually an indication of how coupled is it to other parts, because the less coupled it is, the easier it's to remove it, or more likely you actually want to change or improve it. So this is the architecture and how it is visibly complex around the single platform and how it is maybe less coupled and more flexible around the commerce platform in the composable approach. But of course, another aspect of this is how the technology is actually built and maintained. So let's look at how a composable architecture allows you to increase your development speed and throughput. I somewhat hinted already at this with the client example, with us having multiple teams working concurrently now. But if we look at the platform-based architecture on the left, there's usually one team that works with the platform across all the functionalities. And this, of course, creates clear accountability and a good overview, but it can also have drawbacks since the whole system is intertwined, full of dependencies that you need to consider. With a microservices or composable architecture approach, you can divide members into multiple teams, or you can even work with multiple partners where there's a very clear separation of responsibilities of who owns which part of the final solution. It's the same concept of how Facebook and Amazon and similar services are built and how they scale their development throughput. Amazon famously called their teams the 2 pizza teams to also refer to them as being relatively small, nimble teams that own a specific service within the Amazon ecosystem. And that's really what I alluded to with our client example just now. So what that means is that when you reach a certain size, this microservices or composable architecture will let you have more people working on your overall solution at the same time. So that essentially means an increased speed and faster time to market for the new functionality and the services that you want to deliver. But let me look at this in a little bit more detail even. So here we have a single development team delivering a single to a single platform. This is the platform approach. And it requires a fairly generalist team that can work across the entire solution. You can see from the backlog on the left that the different colored items that come in, they relate to different parts of the system. There's some stuff related to personalization, some related to content, some related to some own customization. And this requires coordination of this backlog. The features actually need to be sequenced across the different areas of your commerce solution. And this can, very often we've seen this, it can cause constant reprioritization as certain different parts of the system need more attention. And this again can cause a fair amount of unfinished work in your system as you start on something and you jump to something else. And this is relatively wasteful. Also, very often we see that the work stream or the coordination isn't actually owned by the development team. Some business stakeholder actually owns this. So that the teams end up seeing the work items, the tickets, as the most important thing, and not so much the domain of what they work on. Is perhaps not that incentive when they don't really own that outcome in the domain. So let's improve on this a little bit by allowing multiple concurrent work streams. So in this example, we have multiple teams, and they actually are cross-functional in that they can, within their domain or within their area, they can take any kind of work in, and they're delivering still to a single platform. So this requires less of this extremely broad experience in a single team. And a team can specialize more in one area. And also they can start to potentially own their area and their domain and try to be more independent or autonomous of the other teams. But while each team has more control over their backlog, this model still requires very strong coordination now at the release level. Like, how do we release changes to the system? How do we make sure we don't step on each other's toes? So in other words, there's still a very strong dependency between the teams. And the release process usually also encourages that we batch up our work. We don't just continuously release small things, which again encourages a lot of unfinished work to pile up that can potentially be wasteful. Perhaps as a side note, also when you're piling up work like this, often reality means we have to reprioritize and recombine those unfinished pieces of work, and each one of them, technically speaking, requires retesting. Does it all still work after it's been repackaged? And often that testing is actually skipped, but really should be done. So you should theoretically have a much higher testing overhead. So let's improve on this once more, and we switch to a composable architecture. In this model, we now have multiple teams delivering to their own component in a composable architecture. So these components are all independent systems. And in fact, we even have 4 teams here, because why not? And each team is now independent entirely. Each has their own release process. They don't have to wait for anyone. And they are delivering to separate systems in this overall solution. There's no need to coordinate the releases with one another, because no one really delivers to a specific, no one else than the team delivers to their own component. Of course, there's still benefit from those teams consuming each other's services at times. So there's a little bit of roadmap coordination, but that is no longer blocking the release itself of changes or improvements. So one small side note is that these multiple release processes will most likely not be cheaper if you look at the cost side of things. But what you get for this is that you get much higher throughput. So the benefit should outweigh the cost. You accumulate much less unfinished work in the system, which itself brings savings with it. Okay, so the last thing I want to say about development teams, let's look how we can go even beyond the model I've described now. And here I want to just reference a company that I have met here in Tallinn, in Estonia. They have this idea of what they call autonomous product teams. And of course, this is just one example. It's not the only way that you can go, but it's an interesting example, which I think this whole composable architecture starts really supporting, that you could venture in this direction. So what this company says is, we have these autonomous product teams, and what that means is that we don't really have any software or IT teams that work on various business goals, but instead each team represents or owns one specific business goal. In many cases, those teams are actually formed by people who identified those business opportunities in the first place. So these teams are entirely autonomous with all the roles they need to achieve their intended outcome, both technical and non-technical. They don't actually report to anybody for direction. They're not dependent on anyone else, including getting approvals for their ideas. or what to work on or how to achieve their objectives. The only thing they're measured on is their outcome. And as I said, they are composed of multiple roles. They're cross-functional in a bigger sense. It's not just what we see in IT teams, multiple IT roles, but they have, if necessary, they have lawyers in there, they have marketing people, logistics experts, product designers, whatever is needed to make that specific business idea, business goal be a success. And they really usually focus on one specific business area or business goal. In our commerce examples, it might be one team that focuses on the last mile fulfillment story. A couple of our clients have realized how valuable it is to own that last mile and own the interaction that they have with their customers at that part of the customer experience. And these teams usually are domain experts. Historically, many software experts that we today look for as thought leaders, they actually came from places where they were domain experts first. They were in manufacturing or in finance, and they were trying to solve manufacturing problems or finance problems. And software was just a tool. Today in IT, especially with our IT departments and IT outsourcing companies, we often focus mostly on the software delivery and the domain part really just comes second. Software is the reason and the task is just the justification. It's somewhat upside down. So here you have the opportunity to again build teams that have an incentive to be and become domain experts. They work together and are can be much closer to the customer or to the business problem. So usually you can have them as being very long-lived, which also is part of the whole incentive thing. And of course, this is all about being minimally dependent on others so that you can move fast and make changes quickly. Okay, Henrik, you wanted to talk about maturity.
Yes, I just wanted to connect a little bit with what Wilko said in terms of talking about how we see this evolution happening on development side. And we do see like it's not just a matter of just having developers sitting in one team, either if it's with a partner or if it's like in-house. We also see like this progression of we've seen in many different business areas like marketing over the years, like how can we embed it close to the business and close to the innovation. So that's really what we see happening, and that's really also where the kind of the composable architecture is really supporting that, to say we can have different teams owning a specific part of the system end to end. And it always connects back to we need to have this increased speed and agility, and especially when you reach a certain size, it's the biggest challenge is a matter of being able to prioritize, but also to be able to develop fast enough and not really sit and having internal handovers that go from, yeah, okay, the need comes somewhere, the requirement, somebody needs to validate the requirements. Over time, it needs to go to the backlog, it needs to go to the dev team. They come back with some questions and then it bounces back and forth a couple of times, instead of having the developers and the business analyst and the architects really close to where the business needs it. So this is a typical evolution that happens in many different areas, but right now what we see with development is just like digital just becomes a core of the business. It's not an add-on anymore. It really comes in and lives and breathes, just as marketing and sales and so on has been doing it for years. But you might ask yourself, all these things, they sound great, and if you're a mid-sized or a small company, you might look at this and say, okay, we're talking about all these kind of people. That sounds very expensive for you just to have that, and also just for you to start having teams internally. So the main question is, like, who and which type of companies do we really see that this composable architecture being a really good fit for? And we made a very, very simplified diagram. And of course, there's exceptions to it. There's always, you know, when you think like that. But in general, we tried to map into two different dimensions here. So one being like the revenue and the size. So what is the size of the company? And the other side is really looking at what is the complexity of the operating model. So if you're a telco company, of course, you're running a more complex operating model than if you're just selling t-shirts online. And just to build on that example, if you're just selling very simple products online, it's just a matter of having them in stock and shipping them out the door. in reality, the composable commerce might not really be for you, like the whole overhead and all these kind of things, because your need would be very equal to a baseline e-com. And there's many platforms out there that give you that really quickly, and a lot of plug and play systems that you can just plug into it. But it kind of, as your business is growing and you're going into more markets and you start meeting like specific market requirements, and you also start to see that, okay, now we kind of bridge out, we're going to have subscriptions and so on. That's where slowly that the complexity of the business goes up. So yeah, so definitely anything within like digital services, finance, telcos, if you have IoT services and so on, it really matters like the complexity goes up in terms of having multiple systems, then it is a good fit for this composable commerce. Of course, there is, as I said, there's exceptions to this model, but that's at least what we're using as a good indicator. And just to give you some practical examples, if you just look at retail. So if you think about retail today, digital is much more than just the e-commerce websites, even though that we do click and collect, pick up in store, looking store inventory, close the store, and these kind of things. The consumers have so many different touch points. It might be self-service checkouts, it might be POS systems, in-store, the info screens, click and collect, customer support. And if you also look at the full journey, you can look at last mile. You can also look at, the advertising or the marketing campaign to drive to acquire like the traffic. And you can also look at the post-purchase service. So there's so many different digital touch points today. And each of these touch points is getting more sophisticated. So just taking the POS, for example, the point of sale system that the in-store sales people are using. Back in the days, it was just a matter of being able to punch in a product SKU and just make sure that you can make an order. Today it's more about, I want to be able to see product information. I want to be able to look up store inventory in my store, the store next to me. I would like to see, can I ship this to the consumer at the home address? I would also like to be able to see some promotions that even might be very specific to this customer. I would like to see if I have a loyalty. I want to see the loyalty points and so on. What is the recommended upsells for this specific customer, right? So all these touch points is getting more sophisticated. So they need to exchange more and more data with each other to make sure that they have this unified view of the customer, of the order, of the product, for example. So this ties into one of the biggest challenges that retail is facing today, is that they have all these different systems and they have dependencies into some large systems that they're looking into replacing. So that's the ERP system and this kind of big e-com platform that they have built over time that create this single point of failure and makes it a bit difficult for them to expand on that in the future. So that's just from a retail point of view. If you look more from a B2B point of view, what we're seeing right now is it's going well past this just self-service ordering portal. So what you want to have, we would like to enable our salespeople with a sales rep app. Of course, we want to have the order portal. We would like to be able to connect all our IoT services. So whenever machines need service, that can be flagged into one portal that the customer is logging into. We might want to make sure whatever products that they find that is connected to all our technical docs and so on. And all this kind of spider web of systems as well also needs to access different information. And again, that's where it's really interesting to start looking at this composable commerce, both because the different systems are owned in different places of the company, but you still want to surface it, all of it, into one experience towards the sales rep or the user or the customer or whoever it is. So that was just to give some practical examples of how we do see these things evolve and one of the main reasons why this composable architecture is really getting a bit of attraction at the moment. But this can look like a little bit like a big feast to take on. And of course, we have a model. If you work with us, we have a specific model that we're going to take you through to figure out would this be a good fit for you or not. But if I was in a company, this would be the four steps I would do. And if I was told like you're not able to engage with an agency to help you, or with a company to help you through this process, help us just to figure out, should we look at this or not? I would start with the why. I would assess the current capabilities. I would look at the business of tomorrow. So what are we trying to do in just 3, 4, 5 years time? And then based on that, I will feel that I will have the right information for me to look into. Would a composable approach actually be good for me or not? So deep diving a little bit into these, starting with the why, and the reason why we want to do that, or I would like to do that, is really just to understand what are we motivated by. Sometimes it's a matter of a burning platform. What we have is so bad it doesn't work. We need something new. In other cases, it's driven by opportunity. So we need to have this because this is a demand from our customers. But getting into the core of why are we even looking into this right now? Why is it that what we have is not working? And how to do that is to identify what is it due to a burning platform or the opportunity? What is our ambitions? So are we ambitious, or are we just focusing on the core business model and just optimizing that bit by bit? I'll also look at the vision. So if we don't have a vision, we need to align that also just in the leadership team or management team or within the digital team. It's like, what do we inspire to come? Like, what are the things that we see competitors doing? And what is our space, or what space do we need to take? And I also look at the markets and challenge and the different channels that we are looking into supporting the customers on, and maybe even the internal users. So that will establish a little bit the reasoning, like what is it that we're trying to do and why are we doing it? Based on that, I will then go into the next step, which is more about assessing the capabilities. So what is the current state of what we have? Is it good? Is it end of life? Is it like, is there any challenges, and what are the challenges? One challenge that we see coming up quite a lot is companies working on quite old technology, which means it's difficult to find developers to maintain it. It's difficult to just work with it. It's very rigid. So of course, that is one of the things to figure out when you're in this phase of I also look at the current capabilities you have from a customer experience perspective. Like, what is the processes that we have? What is our capabilities in terms of actually engaging with our users or our customers, and in terms to get that insight? What is the experience that we give them? Is that on par with the expectations, or are we lacking behind? And what do we do from a customer service perspective? And the reason why I want to do that is that, yes, this is not really technology driven, but it's very important to get that understanding when you start talking about how do we support this in the future, and what is the evolution that and the journey that we want to go on. It needs to kind of connect between like people, processes, and of course the tech stack. That will give you a really good understanding of where you are today. And if you've been working in your business for quite some time, I guess you can do this quite quickly. But again, it's really important to do that. And then a step that many skip is like this, is looking a little bit ahead, because it might be that you're very focused on what is the problems that we have today. We just want to fix our problems that we have, or this integration doesn't work, or this doesn't work, or we would like a new design on our website, or whatever it is. But it's really important to look a little bit to the future as well. Like, what do we actually identify what will happen in 2 or 3 years' time? And this is also an opportunity maybe to involve more people from the company as well, just to get some input. What we usually do in our process, if we engage with companies, we also use like kind of custom input as well, to understand what does the journey look like, what is the gaps, and what is the opportunities that we need to map out, that we potentially need to address now or address in the future. And also map that a little bit with what are the competitors doing. Based on that, you can do an ideation, and it's okay to think outside the box and think, okay, should we play with apps? Should we play with AR? It might not be relevant for you now, but it might be relevant for you in 3 to 4 years' time. And how do you make yourself ready for that? You can even map up just some high-level concept for you to talk about that internally. Like, yes, this is what we want today. This is our current capabilities. This is actually what we would like to enable ourselves to the future. So this might be some crazy ideas behind it, but we need to set ourselves up to have that flexibility, that if it becomes a reality for us to take it on, we are able to do it. And lastly, with that, you would then have the things that you need to understand a little bit on, okay, what is our capabilities today? What is the main challenges and opportunities that we want to address short term? But you also have this, like the business of tomorrow definition a little bit. And that will help you when you start both engaging with different platforms, systems, or partners or agencies, whatever, to kind of map that out and say, this is actually the direction that we believe that we're going to go in. We don't know yet, because nobody knows what's going to happen in the future, but it will also help you to understand how would this architecture or how would this approach help me day one, but how would that also help me in the future? There's a couple of things here that would be helpful for you also to try to address internally as well. And that is, how do we envision that we're going to work with this in the future? Do we want to build all this in-house, or do we want to, build everything externally? Do we envision one partner, multiple partners? And just one thing just to remember is, when you're looking at these things, you always have implementation costs, licenses, maintenance costs, and so on. And it's very important for you also to try to address that very early on in your evaluation as well, because that can be a deciding factor also if you just look short term. So, but let's say, and I think the biggest question for you is maybe at this stage is not selecting specific platforms, but that could just to see what are the two approaches. Like, do we want to go in the direction of having one platform where we get a lot of functionality like the iMac, or do we want to head ourselves and into maybe a long-term strategy on going more into this composable architecture? And if you then have taken that route and said that's what we want to do forward, then there's a couple of scenarios that Wilko would like to talk about.
Okay, good. So now that you have essentially the why covered, you have clarified the strategic direction, your capabilities, and where you need to go. The question is, what would this migration look like? And really, we think there is, broadly speaking, two options. The one is your full replacement, where whatever you have now, you essentially replace in one big sweep, or the other one is the phased replacement. But let's look at the full replacement scenario first. So in the full replacement scenario, this is generally speaking a relatively risky and expensive exercise. So we think it should be reserved for special cases, in the cases where maybe you have been looking for a new platform anyway. This is you're ready to make that move anyway, or maybe you're starting a new digital commerce journey. For example, we have B2B customers or clients that sell to other businesses that are now adding direct to consumer as one of their new commerce journeys. So then, of course, you could use a new approach for the new business venture and essentially keep what working for a while with your existing business. And the reason this is quite risky usually is that if you already have an extensive digital commerce business, then recreating that in a new platform, even if the platform can do most things and you're just configuring and setting it up, it's a lot of work. It is something that is essentially, it's almost always underestimated. It always feels easier than it ends up being. And because it takes so much time and money to re-platform, usually this also only, you invest a lot of time and money to only get to a point where the new platform starts delivering the same amount of value that the old platform did. And that's, at that point, you haven't even started earning a return on your actual investment. So it's usually a fairly big investment that needs to prove itself, and the proof only comes much, much later. We often see in these exercises of these big bangs, we also see this urge to do things better than before, which means, especially since this is such a large project, a lot of untested assumptions. The better than before is not really tested. Those are assumptions that you build into that solution. And some of them will turn out to not be as useful, or might even turn out to be as bad assumptions. But you're really packaging up in this big re-platform exercise, and you only get all that learning much, much later. And of course, in a sort of classic migration, one classic migration strategy or mitigation strategy is to avoid this kind of waste, is to start rolling out a subset of planned features first, instead of this big bang approach. But when you start with a completely new platform, then and you roll out this first so-called MVP, you could leave your customers quite disappointed by things that is missing that they were used to. Of course, you can see this as an opportunity. If this system is such a big bottleneck, or it's really, really old and costly to maintain, or is no longer supported, you could potentially also see this as a wider exercise to improve your business, identify why this is a bottleneck, how your business processes could be done differently. So you could look at this like that as well. But do note that usually new technology, which enables new possibilities for your business, they don't achieve these possibilities on their own. your business usually needs to change along to be able to actually capitalize on these new possibilities. So how should you do that? So generally, the idea is start with a minimum scope and user experience. In fact, even start the new platform next to your old and get the core architecture in place, and then you go from there. We often see this urge to migrate everything, every single integration. And often, if you really think about it, many of them aren't strictly needed. Some processes can stay the old way for some time while the new system starts proving itself. Also consider that which existing systems and services do you already have in your organization? Your ERP, CRM, payment service providers, warehouse solutions, shipping solutions. There's no need to replace any of them, really, at least not all at the same time as you're going through this motion. And so keeping the scope of change as small as possible is really, really good. There's nothing stopping you from doing more once you've done this little bit of, or this small scope. And a pro tip is really to start thinking of how can you drive some of your customers to the new platform. Should it be through soft launches? Should it be through sort of targeted group of customers that you pick to start using your platform and give you feedback? Could it be that your old site has a banner that says, go try our new site and you get free shipping or a discount? Things like that that get a small sample where you get real world feedback on how is your new platform actually performing, while you still have most activity going through the old platform. So now let's look at that with a phased approach in comparison. And generally speaking, this is much lower risk. It's really low risk because the changes are smaller. It's similar to what I already said, but if you intentionally make the changes smaller and more often, then for each change, you can actually observe the effect and you can course correct when necessary. These changes will often also impact your business. It's not just a technology, does it work or not, but it impacts your business. And the smaller changes that happen more often actually means that your business or your organization can adapt, can learn, can get trained on in much smaller chunks and more continuously, rather than with a big bang approach where everything comes in one swoop. And of course, your business may also respond in ways that you can't really predict, like the resistance to change, unexpected bottlenecks in your processes that reveal themselves. And with smaller approach, you can respond to these more continuously, again, instead of dealing with all of them at the same time with a big bang. And of course, you have various options that you can consider on how to do this phased replacement. So one good idea is, as I've shown in my client example earlier, is to actually go headless. When you decouple your experience layer, you add the flexibility to do changes behind the curtain without directly impacting the user experience. Now note, this itself can be quite a big change technically, but usually going to headless with a decoupled front end usually is not a big organizational change. And of course, even here, you can potentially break down the going headless into smaller examples. For example, you could replace your catalog navigation with a new front end, but you leave the complexity of the checkout in the old front end, and you make sure that they are styled similarly so it all feels still seamless to the end user. And the benefit of this headless is that once you've actually made that switch, then decomposing the rest of your solution will again be easier because you have one layer where you control the customer experience. The other option you would have is to change one specific feature in your existing solution to a new best of breed implementation. For example, content management. If that's currently in your e-commerce platform, maybe a new headless content management system could be added, and the front end, especially when you have a headless front end now, could now be adapted to fetch the content from the content management system rather than using it directly from the e-commerce system. Visually, the end customer might not actually even notice if you make it look the same, but your organization starts now already getting the benefit of this best of breed content management solution. Maybe there are better workflows that are modeled in the content system. Approval processes, translations, whatever you have, when it comes with complex content management, your organization might benefit and the customer still sees a familiar experience. You can, of course, also start even adding new channels now that your content system is decoupled and can start feeding content to different channels. The last option you might have is to sort of think of it of moving the source of truth out of your single platform. For example, when we think about products or product information, these are quite useful to have in a product information management system that is really built for this. And you could then go and move the products that are currently in your e-commerce system, or maybe they even came from the ERP, move them into a PIM system and build that integration to your commerce solution. Your commerce solution will still have a copy of the information, so the commerce system might not notice the difference, but from a process point of view, you now have all the possibilities that the PIM system gives you. And again, you can start sending product information even to new channels without doing much more in your commerce engine. So pro tips on this, search for partners in the so-called MAC Alliance. The MAC Alliance puts many vendors that are in this composable architecture space under one umbrella. Many of the products from these vendors actually work quite nicely with each other. And also look for connectors and accelerators that are already built. So you're not really reinventing wheels unnecessarily. So the benefit of this way of working, this phased approach, is that you can think of it that you always have a working solution. You have the existing platform and you're starting to change out one component. Everything else keeps working. For every small change you make, you always have a safe fallback. You know you can switch back to the old system. It's not very far to fall back if a change takes longer or change fails or something like that. You also get the benefit of these best of breed components much sooner, because once the content management system is in there, you can start benefiting from it even before you have finished, for example, the PIM integration. And along the way, you might even start identifying components you don't actually need to move because there's very little benefit. It's more effort than you get benefit from it. And in a big bang approach or full replatform approach, you might not really realize these cases at the beginning when you're still planning. It's much less likely to happen. It will end up being in a plan and you will execute on that plan because it's in there. Here you have the opportunity to see, how far do I need to go? Of course, as I often say, don't look at this only from a cost point of view. It will likely be more expensive. For example, when you move to a PIM system, your product information moves to PIM, and you have built an integration with your existing commerce engine. But if you then later want to replace your existing commerce engine, you might need to build yet another integration. That sounds like double effort. But again, look at this as the benefit you get from having the new solution sooner, at least part of that. And all of that also reduces your risks dramatically. So the benefits of all of this might easily outweigh the higher cost. So this is about
we got a very specific question to what you're talking about, and it's because I'm cautious about some of you might need to drop in a couple of minutes. We've already spent an hour. Time goes fast when you have fun. Mm-hmm. So there's one specific question from Simon that is related to a little bit to this. And the question sounds like, if you're going, so when you're going headless the way, you'll need to have a storefront solution, since you don't have any front-end layer, and you would need something to integrate the CMS and commerce platform towards, and also other third-party solutions such as loyalty personalization. Then I think there's two questions. It's first, will it still be composable commerce then? Second, and the second question is, how easy is it to change a system when it's integrated to the storefront? So I assume the last question is, we now integrate, we take our solution we have today, we make it headless, we integrate into this new front end, and now we want to replace into a different. You start a massive project to do that.
Okay, so I would say to that yes, this is composable commerce, because you are composing multiple things together and you are unifying this in a single storefront. When you then need to change some systems, I'm assuming you mean systems that are integrated to the storefront, not changing the storefront. I think the effort of that is not going to go away, if I can put it like this. However, the replacement of one of those backend services towards or the integration between those backend services and your front end is limited and focused to that one change that you're making. Whereas in the traditional way, you might have, you already mentioned third-party solution, loyalty, personalization, etc. If you were to exchange one of those, the change is limited to that one if you change your personalization engine, rather than you having to iterate through all of those different components in your single platform. If, of course, you want to replace your front end, your storefront solution, that will likely be a larger exercise again, where you will need to make sure that the loyalty support is there, the personalization is there. But then again, you could potentially also do incremental migration to something else, but that you might not get away from directly. But
so,
again, your
follow-up question to that, Wilko, would be a little bit on, is there a benefit, because there's a lot of different these headless frameworks, which is kind of more or less dedicated systems by themselves. Would it be beneficial to look at what do we have as a business today? Is there already pre-built some kind of connection between what we have and what do we want to move towards in the future? Is there any benefits of looking at from that angle and trying to align that we kind of want to kind of take, we were using the headless or the storefront as a little bit of a migration tool, if you can take like that, and we take it in steps.
Yes, I think it would certainly be good to look at what connectors and are already available that relate to products that you already have. You don't really want to invent it, and I think when you build something yourself or have it built for you, this also usually comes the maintenance side of this with it. So if you can use something existing, it usually means it's well tested, it's maintained by someone else, and is a good starting point at the very least. However, I think one thing to potentially also think of in this composable commerce space, if we go all the way back to one of the first slides around the PACE layered architecture, the top layer of that, the system of innovation, was characterized by being trying to respond fast to change. That's why you separate those systems out. And I think it's good to often also think a little bit of how do you keep that front-end layer thin so that it is easier to change this, rather than to build too much functionality in there. Try to see, can this be delegated back to systems that own a part of that customer experience rather than the front end doing everything. So it's a careful balance.
Okay, so we're getting to the end of the webinar. Thank you guys for sticking on so long. Just the last thing that we just wanted to say is there's many different ways to take this on, but the main thing that we see is talking about composable is a bit more technical. So compared to how you've done things in the past, so one of the things that you need to ask yourself is, do you have the experience to run technical projects in general? And also, do you want to be in the forefront of technology? Because there's a lot of things happening right now in this space. Things are moving really, really fast. And with that innovation, there's sometimes a benefit to being one of the front runners, but it could also mean that you will need to reinvest in some of those things down the line. So maybe the headless framework that you're choosing, what is the flavor of the month? Then it's something else in a half a year time or 12 months time. But it's kind of evolving very, very fast at the moment. So that's just some of the takeaways. Wilko and I is more than happy to engage with you after this webinar today to give our personal reflection also on your specific business and what you're looking into, whether this, based on our experience, whether that will be a good way or a good thing for you to look into or not. So based on that, we'll just thank you all for attending the webinar today. Please remember to go by our website. We have a lot of great content, resources, white papers in there that you can look at, and also on the composable architecture topic. So have a great day.
Okay, thank you all for joining us.